Good afternoon, and welcome to Energy Finance 2021 online. I think we may be having some technical difficulties, but we'll get started again. I'm Sandy Buchanan, Executive Director of the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. I'm coming to you today from Cleveland, Ohio. Our opening session today will set the stage for our conference for the next 2 weeks with the theme of Two Energy Economies, One World. Before we get started, let me explain how our question and answer session will work. We have a chat box there on the right of your screen where you can feel free to put questions in for our speaker, and our moderator will relay those to him. You can also use the chat box to interact with other attendees. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator, Sergio Knaebel. Sergio is the Vice President of the Sandler Foundation in San Francisco, where he is concentrated on climate and clean energy, coal, marine conservation, and conservation of coastal land in Baja California. Sergio is also the Vice President of IEEFA's Board of Directors. And now let me introduce Sergio so that he can introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. It's very nice to be here and to welcome everyone to this year's Energy Finance Conference, and especially this Two Economies, One World keynote. It is my pleasure to introduce Michael Liebreich. He's the CEO of Liebreich Associates, the founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the host of the Cleaning Up podcast, where you can find him holding forth with a beer in hand on matters of energy policy, finance, climate solutions, and the economics of clean technology. If you have a shorter attention span, I recommend you also check him out on Twitter. We can count on him for incisive analysis and a hopeful perspective that helps the rest of us mere mortals understand where we are in the present and where we may be going in the future. So Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Sergio, for your kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Really an honor to be here at IEEFA 2021. Sadly, I understand it's a great event in person, but this year I'll have to make do with being here virtually. So what I thought I could do was start with an overview, a kind of tour of the global state of play in the transition to net zero or to clean energy. And then hopefully we'll have time for those questions and answers, which I know you're all looking forward to. So I will now share my screen and let's get started. There we are. Now, I'm hoping that everybody can see that. So just one more click and we're off. There we go. So where are we today? A really pivotal time, clearly coming out of the COVID pandemic, which has been just so disruptive and so tragic for so many. But we are also at the beginning of a decade, which is, as Winston Churchill would say, really a decade of consequences. This is a decade that really matters. And around the world, what we're seeing is the momentum towards net zero, towards climate action, really picking up speed. So we've got at the end of the year, obviously, COP26, the big conference in Glasgow. And one of the things that's going on in the background is that countries which have committed to net zero by 2050, in some cases 2060, turning those commitments into the formal nationally determined contributions. But it's a very hopeful time because the percentage of the global GDP, which is covered by those commitments and hopefully turned into those nationally determined contributions, is already 78%. So this is a world away from where we were just a few years ago when the Paris agreements were signed. We are now at a point where countries are looking to go to net zero. Now, that's the hopeful view. The theme for the conference here is one world, one energy world, two economies, one world, two energy economies. And those two economies split in various different directions, in my view. So you have obviously the developing split, which we'll talk about a little bit. You've got the clean energy, you've got the fossil or the incumbent split, and you've also got the optimism pessimism split. And here you see the great Greta Thunberg, and she says basically nothing is being done to halt this crisis. It's all just beautiful words. So one world where countries are pledging, and another world where Greta Thunberg is pointing out that nothing is being done. And I'll see if we can tease that apart and see which, if either of those, is true. So this is the growth in CO2 emissions from the energy system, and it's easy to see why Greta would be so disparaging of efforts so far. But I want to draw your attention to this part of the chart, and we can expand it here, and you can see something really quite extraordinary. And this is was going on before the COVID pandemic, and you can already see that whilst the global economy over the past 7 years has grown by 26%, over a quarter, emissions will only have grown by 3%. So I think it's already possible to say that we are at or near peak emissions. So we are most certainly doing something. And here you can see another cut of those two worlds. This is fossil fuel investment and investment in clean energy, so in renewables, in nuclear, and in electrification. And you can see that the trend, the scissor movement that is squeezing fossils out of the system, that's resulting in that peaking of emissions, really started around 2012, 13, and has accelerated since. Now let's zoom in to the investment in clean energy. This is something that I started tracking when I founded New Energy Finance all the way back in 2004. So you can see a very long timeline now. And what you'll see is that the investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage, the net zero technologies really stalled around the year 2010. So it's over $1/3 trillion per year, but it's not going up. And certainly as we look towards net zero, not just peak of emissions, we clearly need to see that change. We need to see those investments start to rise again. But if you look at it from the lens of installed capacity, then you see that renewable installed capacity has not slowed down. In fact, it has continued to increase. So there's another scissor movement within the scissor movement where the investment might go flat, but the installed capacity of renewable energy continues to go up. Now, this is, of course, the gathering of energy economists and financial analysts. So I know that you know exactly why this has happened. This second scissor movement, it's the experience curve, it's the learning curve. And it's just extraordinary, though, to remind ourselves how quickly it has been happening. This is 2011, just 10 years ago. And at that time, I can't tell you how many people asked me, when will renewable energy be grid competitive? All day I was asked that. And you can see that it was not grid competitive. Solar photovoltaics at 17 cents per kilowatt hour was about 3 times the cost of electricity from gas and coal. Wind was more expensive. Offshore wind, forget it. The answer to that question, when would it be grid competitive, was 2015. 2015, you can see there, 6 cent solar photovoltaics, 6 cents for wind. Offshore wind, of course, still too expensive. And of course, these are world records. This is the cheapest at the time. And we'll talk a bit in a moment about intermittency. Where we are today, those world records have continued to fall. So we're now at the point there where solar photovoltaics, the cheapest projects anywhere in the world, are within very small shooting distance of 1 cent, 1 US cent per kilowatt hour. Wind, a little bit more expensive, 1.8 cents, but even offshore wind now under 5 cents per kilowatt hour, so cheaper than gas, cheaper than coal, new built coal with all the environmental protection that involves, and certainly cheaper than nuclear. Now, I've said two things that we need to come back to. One is that these are world records, and the other is that they're variable. So the point about world records, what we have seen, and I've now tracked it for nearly 20 years, is that the world record becomes the median in a good resource location in somewhere around 3 to 5 years. So if you think these are special cases, they're not. This is the direction of travel. This is the postcard from the future. And then intermittency we'll see can also be managed. There's a number of technologies that we'll use to do that. So where are we going? This is the green line at the bottom. You can see 2 decades ago, it was possible to ignore clean energy. A decade ago, it was possible to laugh at clean energy, 1 or 2% of electricity. And now when it reaches 11% in 2019, and it's going to go to, it must be today, we don't have the data, but it must be at 13 or 14% of all global electricity coming from modern variable renewables, there is a real fight going on. And clean energy, you can see from that green curve as it accelerates, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know what's going to happen next. It's a penetration curve, it's a substitution curve, and so it's going to continue to grow. And then ultimately, once it's deeply penetrated into the power system, it will saturate and flatten out. That's not going to happen anytime soon. So let's now look at the other world. That was the clean world where we're seeing it penetrating and growing. The other world, the fossil energy world. This is a quotation from George Orwell, the great English writer. Our civilization is founded on coal. The machines that keep us alive, the machines that make machines, all directly or indirectly dependent on coal. And this is the history of coal. And it is truly the history of coal, because this is a picture, longest timeline that I've ever presented in an energy presentation, 1850 to 2030. You can see this is coal growing, becoming so important that George Orwell made that quote, and then being forced off the system. And it's happened fast. In as recently as 2012, coal produced 40% of UK electricity. Today, the figure is a couple of percent, and by 2025, the figure will be 0. Is it just the UK? No, this is the US. Of course, we know we've just got a new administration in the US. The previous administration vowed to fight for coal, to end the war on coal, promised to gain more coal jobs. And you can see there the speed with which transitions, maybe an overall transition will be long and slow, but you can see here really fast transitions in specific sectors. UK, 7 years to go from 40% to 2%. US, 13 years for a nearly 60% reduction in coal. And so it's a comparable speed to the sorts of transitions we're familiar with from other sectors, particularly from digital media sector. And you can see there, newspaper print ad collapsed by a similar amount in a similar time. Is this just the developed world? No, here you can see the capacity factors around the world for coal. The coal, even though it's there are still new coal-fired power stations being built, the capacity factors are plummeting. And ultimately what kills coal is the economics, not the war on coal, not the policy, it's actually the economics. So around the world, we heard so much just a few years ago about China building 1 or 2 coal-fired power stations every week. You can see the green line there is net capacity additions, and it's being squeezed out. There's a lot of capacity also being retired. You can see below the line there in gray. And we are almost at the point where no net new coal capacity is going to be added to the system worldwide within just a few years. These are final investment decisions for new coal plants. You can see there as it full, that's why the net new capacities falling off the grid because nobody is making these decisions to launch new plants, to fund new plants, to build new plants at the same rate they used to. But what's happening to gas? The same chart here for gas. Is the coal simply being replaced by gas? No. The age of gas that we heard about some 5, 6, 7 years ago from the IEA and others is simply not materializing. Gas is more robust, more of it will stay on the system than coal, but we are not seeing a surge, a dash for gas. Why not? Well, the very cheap renewables that we've already seen account for it. Around the world, more than 2/3 of the population live in countries where either wind or solar are cheaper. So if your grid is capable of integrating more of that wind and solar power, variable though it is, it beats out gas. So the existing resources on the grid are being reconfigured around the world to provide more and more flexibility to integrate this very cheap, this super cheap variable renewables. And then, of course, that leaves you with a peaking problem, because you then have the times when it's not sunny, when it's not windy, and of course, for that, gas is pretty useful. But gas's problem for that peaking use is that batteries are pretty useful too. And so in this chart, you see a break-even point where batteries beat gas. So you've got the dark line is a gas peaker, the blue line is a battery, and you can see that as long as your peak demand every day is lower than somewhere around 3 or 4 hours, it's actually cheaper to build a battery than to build and then buy gas. And of course, the batteries become cheaper over time. And so a 3-hour break even becomes a 4-hour break even, becomes a 5-hour break even, becomes a 6-hour break even, and so on. So the gas is being forced out of the bulk electricity market, but it's also being forced out of the peaking market. Now, things are getting complicated as well. It's not just a replacement like for like. You're also seeing the system becoming more complex, more resources, not just the demand side varying, now the supply side. And of course, I don't need to tell the people on this call that you need to balance the grid, whether it's short-term, medium-term, or long-term. The lucky thing is that there are a bunch of different technologies. These ones are already at scale and growing at double-digit rates, which can be used to achieve that balancing in real time, which always has to be maintained between supply and demand. There's also other technologies which are less well developed that can be used at the short end, so at the rapid, at the minutes, seconds, minutes, and into hours. And there are technologies at the longer end. And we're going to dive into a couple of these. We'll look at electric vehicles, we'll look at hydrogen. But there's another thing that's going on, another powerful driver of change, and that is digitization. There is no way of running the grid, the energy system, the transport system, the water system, the infrastructure of the future without digitization. And there, luckily, things are moving very rapidly in parallel with the net zero transition. So electric vehicles. We've already seen experience curves. We've become very expert at plotting them. New Energy Finance has got a wealth of data, not just about wind and solar, but also about EV batteries. And you can see there the sort of drop, over 90% drop in the last decade. And we're going to see another 70% drop in the battery prices in the coming decade. But the push for electric vehicles is not just about low-cost batteries. Another very powerful force has been air quality. These are just some photos from places that I visited in the years up to the COVID pandemic. You can see that's London, that's Madrid, that's Bangkok in Thailand, that's Delhi. For many mayors, it's much easier to act on air quality than on climate. But we are acting, and that is resulting in the pushing out of internal combustion vehicles from cities around the world. So we're seeing surging numbers now of electric vehicles. You see there passenger EVs. There are now around 10 million at the end of 2020, 10 million around the world. We're seeing buses, commercial vehicles, electric 2- and 3-wheelers. The electrification wave in transportation is gathering steam. So it's not just about the Tesla or even the Volkswagen or whichever other make of electric car. It's also about commercial vehicles. There is now a feeling that heavy vehicles will go to hydrogen. In fact, the electric heavy vehicles work perfectly well up to around 500 miles. Specialist vehicles, diggers, garbage trucks, agricultural vehicles. We're seeing electric ferries. We're seeing coastal vessels. Not every vessel sails from Brazil to China carrying iron ore, or from Australia to China carrying coal. The short distance vessels going electric, and even aviation, general aviation, the replacement of probably all helicopters going to go electric, and even in medium and longer haul, the planes will go to hybrids. They may be powered using hydrogen and fuel cells, or even using a biofuel or a synthetic fuel, but the drivetrain is likely to go electric for reasons of thrust, of quietness, and efficiency. Now, the car companies have, of course, all realized this is an iconic move in 2020, last year, by Daimler. After 135 years, it ceased all development of a next generation internal combustion engine platform. The oil companies have been a bit slower to catch up. This is the IEA oil supply forecast, and it's symptomatic, or it's typical of forecasts of oil companies around the world, also of OPEC, whereby demand for oil was always seen as growing. These were forecasts made pre-2000. In the first decade after the year 2000, you could see that the orthodox thinking was oil demand always grows, maybe a bit slower than we thought. And you can see there, oil demand always grows, slower than we thought a little bit, but still always growing. Well, in 2015, I proposed that we may be in a transition which would see oil demand peaking. And this year, BP published its core business as usual scenario, which was pretty much exactly in line with that postulated transition scenario that I had proposed in 2015. And in fact, their accelerated change scenario is for a much quicker drop in the use of oil in transportation. Now, I said I'd talk a little bit about hydrogen. We all know that there's this enormous amount of attention on hydrogen at the moment. Country after country has a hydrogen strategy. What I would say is those hydrogen strategies are very coherent on the supply side, but much less so on the demand side. So on the supply side, of course, the oil companies have seamlessly switched into promoting hydrogen. You can see there, delivered today, if you're looking for clean hydrogen, then blue hydrogen from fossil fuels is cheaper than hydrogen produced through electrolysis. But as we go forwards, that gap will narrow and it will reverse. So by 2030, maybe by 2040, almost certainly by 2050, certainly, green hydrogen, hydrogen from clean energy electrolysis, will be cheaper than blue. Now, the question is, where will it be used? And I've tried to summarize the current thinking, the current zeitgeist on hydrogen in this chart. It's the Swiss Army knife. It can be used for everything: fuels, chemicals, aviation, transport, heat, power. There is nothing that hydrogen can't do for us. But I'm going to postulate that we should be thinking of a different household appliance, not a Swiss Army knife, but a ladder when it comes to thinking about where hydrogen really will be useful. And the reason is this: if you look at an application for which hydrogen is so often promoted, which is a car, then you see that yes, a fuel cell car has slightly longer range. And yes, if you're on a long trip, it might be slightly more convenient to refuel. But that trip really needs to be longer than, at the moment, 150, 160 miles. And as batteries get more energy dense and cheaper, that number will go up. And I speak as somebody who today did over 100-mile trip in an electric car without the faintest shadow of range anxiety. And meanwhile, the electric car is cheaper. The electric car accelerates better. The electric car's got more room. The electric car can be charged at home or at the shopping mall quite conveniently, very conveniently. And it is twice as efficient. That green hydrogen that you want to use is twice better used in an electric car than in a hydrogen car. So let me correct that. The green electricity that you would use to make the green hydrogen is twice better used in the electric car directly than in a hydrogen car. And so we see this. There's the growth of battery electric vehicles and drawn to scale fuel cell vehicles. And if we came back, if I'm invited back in 10 years' time, I will show the same chart. The scale will have changed, probably by a factor of 5, 10, and battery electric vehicles will still be selling this much, and fuel cells to scale will be almost invisible. And so there's your ladder, not a Swiss Army knife. A ladder is the right way to think about hydrogen. There are some things at the top of the ladder we cannot do with gray hydrogen for climate reasons. We cannot do without clean hydrogen. But down at the bottom of the ladder, there are things we will not do with hydrogen because they are simply better done with direct electrification. Now, you can disagree with some of the positionings, whether things should be a little higher or a little lower, and no doubt many of you will, but this idea that some things need hydrogen and some things are better done without it, I think is very powerful. And I want to finish by talking a little bit about sustainable finance, because all of this needs one particular fuel, and that is money. There is now a bewildering array of initiatives that are trying to redirect money, trying to tilt the playing field so that the money is invested in the clean stuff, the clean world, the clean energy world of the two, and not the fossil CO2 emitting world. And those initiatives, although they're bewildering, they can be segmented, and it makes sense that they go across the financial value chain. So you've got everything from civic society applying pressure through banks, asset managers, asset owners, the insurers, the central bank, the index providers, the providers of data and information. This is a completely different world from 10 years ago when I wrote a piece complaining that the financial system was institutionally fossilist. In other words, that the economics of clean energy were improving and deserving of investment, but that the financial system was discriminating against them and funding fossil fuels. And we're now at a point where that balance is tipping. And in fact, the central banks are discussing and talking about tipping it even further so that the money flows downhill into clean energy and clean transportation instead of uphill. To put it in perspective, you can see there that there is about $400 trillion in the world of financial assets. That's everything from your savings, your pension, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, asset managers, the whole lot, $400 trillion. Only a small amount is dedicated already to sustainability in name and in definition. Divestment is really not the biggest deal, 15 trillion. So of course, 15 trillion is a lot of money, but the really big moves are here in the middle area where around a quarter to a third of all the savings in the world are already now taking into account sustainability and climate change in their investment decisions. Now, I said that divestment is not really the most significant trend. There's another reason for that, that here you can see the weighting of energy in the S&P 500 and how it's changed over time. And it's gone from 16% to 2.4%. And this is a form of divestment through value destruction, divestment through value diminution, because energy has gone from being a 16% of the global economy, and as you can see, is now only under 2.5%. But that is a temporary phenomenon. That is because the companies in the S&P 500 are the largest companies. So what that's really saying is that the large energy companies, which are the oil and gas companies, and at the beginning of this period, even the coal companies, they have shrunk in relative value. And so far, they have not been replaced with the clean energy behemoths of the future. Now, what does that future look like? This is from the IEA's net zero report that they just put out last month. If we are to stay on track for 1.5 degrees for net zero by 2050, what does that future need to look like? And you can see there, divided into 3 big chunks of activity: the renewable energy, a factor of 4 growth in capacity additions during the next decade; electric vehicles, an 18% growth in their sale; and energy efficiency has to continue, has to accelerate from where it is at the moment, which is around 2% per year to 4% per year. And if that happens, we will see those very large energy companies, those clean energy companies, getting into the S&P 500 to replace the value diminution that we've just seen. And I'll finish with a quote from Antonio Gramsci, the co-founder and leader of the Italian Communist Party. Because what he said, the quote that he had at the time, it was about social change, is really very apt when we think about these 2 worlds that we're here during this conference to consider. The old is dying, and the new struggles to be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. In other words, in the detail of the sector, of the technology, of the country, of the pushback by the incumbents, of the political process, there can be a lot of uncertainty, morbid symptoms, but the direction of travel is not in doubt. And with that, I'll conclude. I will try to stop sharing here, and we can go into Q&A.
Thank you, Michael. That was brilliant. I think we all appreciate such a great overview. And I'm feeling pretty good. It feels like this, this transition is really happening. But my question is it happening fast enough? Is investment happening at the pace that's needed to maintain the trends that you highlighted? And I'm curious what you think the role of government is in that. And even, on the private sector side, like index funds, what role can they play in helping to accelerate this transition?
So there's really 3 separate questions. Is it going fast enough? Role of government and index funds. And I'll try and answer those 3. So is it going fast enough for 1.5 degrees? Very simple answer, no. I don't think that we're going to hit 1.5 degrees. That would imply net zero global economy by 2050. I think that the developed world can get very close to that. We already know that China is targeting 2060, Brazil 2060. There's 22% of the world. We saw 78% was pledging was pledging net zero by 2050 or 2060, not only could they be delayed, but there's also the 22% that has not yet pledged. And these are very difficult countries, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, countries that also have to grow very rapidly to bring wealth and a good standard of living to their people. And they have every right to do so. Now, I think a lot could be done for them to leapfrog, particularly where we're over the tipping point. There's very cheap wind, very cheap solar, very cheap batteries, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not the case with things like heating or aviation or shipping or some of the industrial processes, cement production, brick making. It's very hard to see those transitioning in those economies fast enough for us to get to 1.5 degrees. So I think fast enough for 2 degrees, probably yes, 1.5, no. Second question that you had was the role of government. This is a dance. This is a dance between the government, business and finance, the innovators, civic society, and also us as consumers. And at the moment, we as consumers and as civic society are sending very mixed messages. We're saying, we want net zero. We want fossil fuel companies to be penalized, to be stigmatized, but we also want to fly on holiday. We also want to heat our homes. And if you're in the developing world, we also want to have good quality housing and hospitals and roads, and we don't want dirt floors, we want nice concrete floors and so on. So we're sending these mixed signals, and there's only so much that government can do, because they have to sort of mediate between this slightly schizophrenic personality of the public, putting these two conflicting pressures onto the system, the economic system. So I think government can do a lot more. Government can be braver, but it does have to bear in mind it is still providing health, standard of living, resilience, and so on. And finally, index funds. I mean, index funds are almost like a flywheel, because what they tend to do is the companies in them tend to be the larger funds. You get into an index fund, your market cap increases, which means that your cost of capital drops. And so it kind of locks in the incumbency. And of course, that also turns it into a seesaw. You know, when you're a kid, you walk up one side of the seesaw, you get to the top, you come down the other side at a run. So once those clean energy companies start getting into the big indices, that will actually accelerate the shift. Look at what happened with coal. Once it got into trouble, it was out really fast. And that's, I think, what we're going to see.
Okay. I have an interesting question in the chat here, which I have, I don't know what take I would have on this, but as a futurist, maybe you have a perspective on it. What does Bitcoin uptake mean for some of the trends you've described?
So I'm pretty old school on Bitcoin. I'm having trouble seeing what value it provides to society. I can understand that there are people winning from it, but it seems to be an awful lot of activity for very little real delivery. And I don't mean just for society, but I mean in terms of real economic value. What business does it enable that you can't do through a normal payment system, a Visa or a WorldPay or a MasterCard and so on? And I can see, yes, if you want to buy and sell drugs or weapons or to get ill-gotten gains out of a country, I can kind of see that. I can see that. But as a store of value, it's still very questionable. Certainly doesn't have the ability of, you know, something like gold. It's not portable in the same way. You can't just take it and escape across the border with it. And so therefore, for me, the energy use of Bitcoin is simply a negative. And this idea that it somehow enables more renewable energy is nonsense. It's simply providing demand for electricity. It's being fulfilled to a large degree using coal. And if it went away tomorrow, I would not be unhappy. But as I say, I'm old school. That doesn't mean I tar all cryptocurrency activity with the same brush. I think that some of the smart contract activity that uses Ethereum, for instance, is very, very interesting. and if they can solve the energy demand and the dirty energy demand particularly, then I think it's a really interesting addition to the portfolio of solutions, because it should enable us to transact. It should enable my solar roof to sell electricity to your washing machine, or to Sandy's in Cleveland, Ohio. That would be an ideal situation. And clearly the accountancy of that, if you didn't have a blockchain distributed ledger solution, would be simply unthinkable.
So we have a question here about the transition and some of the slides you shared, and a request to talk a bit more about what you see as the biggest barriers there in escalating the transition, and public funding infrastructure, technological, or the political influence of incumbents. What are the biggest barriers as you see them?
I think one of the biggest barriers is time, because the thing about learning curves is you have to learn. This is one of the things that I think is potentially going to trip up the clean hydrogen movement. That it's all very well to say, well, green hydrogen is going to be really cheap because electrolyzers get cheap and they use cheap electricity, and it'll become cheaper to even store or move hydrogen around. It will, but only if you make lots of electrolyzers, only if you actually start doing it. So time is one problem. I also see, by the way, in that specific case, I think there's too many governments that buy the Swiss Army knife analogy and not the ladder. And so I can also see some big mistakes, some misallocation of taxpayers' money. It's very nice for a politician to announce a hydrogen local train. You get your photo taken with a hard hat and a high-vis jacket. And of course, that's a stupid solution, because trains are electrified, local trains are electrified, and if they're not, stick a battery on them and the job's done. So I do see some of those sort of pitfalls. I think the other thing is there are some very difficult sectors. Natural gas is just really cheap. If the homework question is heat, then natural gas is a really good answer. And so your hydrogen cost equivalent to compete with natural gas is actually not $2 per million BTU. It's something like 50 cents per million BTU. No, it's even less than that. I think it's 25 cents per million BTU. Or put it another way, hydrogen would need to get down to not just $1 per kilogram, but actually it would need to get down to 25 or 40 cents, something like that, to be able to start out competing heat. So we're going to still need carbon prices, right? We're going to still need carbon prices, and they're not in place everywhere around the world. And the final part of that answer, you raised the question about what about politics? If you gave me just one Christmas wish, it would be to get fossil fuel lobbying and corruption out of the system. Get the money out of the politics, get the corruption out of the system. So in fact, that's two wishes. One is a reform of campaign finance, particularly, of course, in the US, and the other is bearing down on the corruption. So initiatives like publish what you pay and so on. We need to reinvigorate those, because when the fossil fuel companies can no longer buy the politicians, either legally or illegally, again, it's one of those things that will tip the seesaw remarkably quickly.
So kind of related to this issue, what is the role of the financial system in decarbonizing heavy industry like cement, steel, chemicals? What should financial actors be asking from these industries?
So I think the first part of any answer to that has to revolve around risk. The financial actors, before they start remunerating this behavior or penalizing that through some complex new mechanism, it's really, the first and foremost, they need to think about risk. And of course, disclosure, because without data, you can't evaluate risk. But I think what we need the financial sector is to demand, before it allocates capital to those activities, to say, what is the real risk, physical risk to this plant? If we put it, a lot of heavy industry is very close to coastlines. It's close to port areas, because the raw materials come in very often by ship or by pipeline, and they get landed in those areas. They're at physical risk, and they're also at transition risk, in that if you make steel, which has got a lot of embodied carbon in it, then the risk is that sometime in the next few years, consumers will say, well, I don't want a car that's made by a car company that doesn't give a damn about emissions. So I think if we can get those risks disclosed and quantified, that will get us a long way there. And there's one trend which is really, I think, in favor of decarbonization, which is going to gather steam very, very quickly, which is right now, those sorts of risks are in ESG statements, right? Environmental, social governance statements. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of in the soft bit of disclosure. Frankly, I'm sorry to say it, but a lot of financial analysts simply don't read them. They might flick through them, but they really don't care. If you can quantify that risk, if you have to quantify that risk, and you have to put it into your financial accounts, suddenly you're talking about write-downs. You're talking about impairments of assets. And I can tell you that the weather will change in the investor community overnight when that happens.
Well, we have a question from Nicholas Cunningham, a journalist with DSMOG. And he says, lots of oil analysts say that net zero pledges and a rapid shift in financial markets towards clean energy are sowing the seeds of a supply crisis. What's your view on this?
I think there's a great danger of exactly that. Just last week, the court in Holland found that Shell's net zero plan was inadequate. It was unconstitutional, and Shell had to go back and remake its plans for a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030, and not what it was previously, which I think was around 20 or 25%. And there was great rejoicing from the climate community. And the problem with that is that Shell's only real response to that, other than appealing and hoping that the law is bad, and I suspect it might be, but other than appealing, what can Shell do? Well, it would have to divest. It would have to sell assets. So and who would buy those would be generally unscrutinized players, private equity players, and particularly players that might be in countries that are not on their own net zero transitions. I'm talking about Russia, I'm talking about the former Soviet countries, I'm talking about the Gulf, the GCC countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, because those owners can, from a societal perspective, locally own those assets. And they'll get them cheap, because not only is Shell selling, BP is selling, Repsol is selling, Total is selling. And so we could see a fire sale of assets and underinvestment at the same time in the supply side of oil, but without what I talked about earlier, without society being consequent and saying, right, we're very happy that there is that pressure on production of oil, but we're not prepared to act with the same sort of determination on the demand side. So we're not pushing the substitution or doing things like taxing aviation fuel at anything like the same rate. So you've got a fire sale of assets at the same time as underinvestment in new exploration. So very easy to see that there could be a spike in oil prices. Does that mean that it's game over? No, because a spike in oil prices also means that more people will be buying electric cars. It means a new impetus for energy efficiency and so on. And so the world will keep turning. But I think it's inappropriate simply to celebrate demonization of oil companies when we are not prepared to do what it takes as society to address the demand for their perfectly legal and in fact essential products.
At the top of your presentation, you talked about these splits, and one of them is between rich countries and poor countries. And there's a question here from Anis, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Azuni. So what do you say to countries that are entering oil and gas at this point?
When you say entering oil and gas, you can enter oil and gas in two different ways, as a producer or as a consumer and importer. I would say if you're a consumer and importer, look very hard at the alternatives and at the economics of the alternatives, because what you don't want to do is accept conventional wisdom that only coal can make you a wealthy country, only oil, only gas. Well, only oil could power your transportation, and only gas is any good for heating and the peaks of your electricity demand and for industry. There are alternatives. I've presented on them. You'll get a deck of those slides. Can have anybody can pick through them, and you'll see that those trends are very powerful. So if you're entering in the sense of being a demand side country, think very, very carefully. If you're a producer, I think it's just very, very difficult. It's very hard to go to a producing country that's a poor country and say, well, you've got oil under the ground, you could extract it, and there may be at least one big super cycle of high prices, but we'd rather you leave it there. And I think that I don't think anybody has any easy answers, but what I would say is don't get yourself in a position of two evils. One is the resource curse. So don't go diving into oil in such a way that it makes the rest of your economy internationally uncompetitive, drives up your currency, absorbs all the skills, perhaps leads to corruption. And then the second evil, it goes away because in due course, the demand for that resource will fall away. So really, probably the advice is go for it carefully and make sure you put the bulk of your earnings from those resources, which will probably only be valuable for a decade or two, into a sovereign fund. Think about the long-term sustainability of your economy and development of your people. They deserve better than a boom bust.
Mm-hmm. And well, looking at your crystal ball on this for another second, what do you think the export credit agencies might do, and what is the impact of them?
Well, so I think they play an absolutely critical role. A lot of the focus right now is stop funding fossil assets, and I think that's entirely appropriate, with one caveat: start funding the alternatives at scale, because it is not appropriate to go to very poor countries and say, well, we're all being virtuous here, we're not going to let you have a coal-fired power station. The moment you say that, it's a bit like saving somebody's life. I understand in the Japanese culture, you then become responsible for them forever. If you say we are simply on principle because of our Western principles not going to do that, then you have a responsibility to help that country to leapfrog to a cleaner source of power or of energy. And what I would also say, you have a technical responsibility, and that is to figure out how to lower the cost of capital, not just of your piece. It's not just, well, here's some concessionary finance, thank you, we're out of here. It is also to think through the structuring to push down the cost of capital across the capital stack, because clean resources, by definition, are mainly CapEx. They're mainly capital cost and very little running cost. And so they become very, very sensitive to cost of capital. And, you can flip it all on its head and say it's actually a fantastic opportunity for a lot of very poor countries are in the Sun Belt. They have potentially very low cost solar power, and some of them have low cost solar and wind, which is fantastic, but not if you have a high cost of capital. So if you're in the credit finance, the credit agencies, if you're in the multilateral finance system, it is your responsibility to help those countries figure out low costs of capital. There are ways of doing it. I'm on the advisory board. I can plug it because it's a nonprofit. I'm on the advisory board of something called the Green Map Association. It's a nonprofit that tries to help countries design policies which encourage competition to push down cost of capital for clean resources. It can be done. It has been done, but we need it to be done across the board in these countries.
So turning to another topic that's been in the news a lot recently, and I think is of great interest to your audience, how much faith do you put in the net zero commitments of oil companies?
Again, I have to sort of disclose my interest here because I am on the international advisory group of Equinor, and I can, without disclosing what we talk about, I can tell you that those discussions about net zero are really detailed and they are in really good faith. This is not an attempt to say, I wish it would go away, and can't we just get back to business doing what we do so well, and that is just increasing the amount of oil and gas and be done with it. These are really difficult discussions. I also have seen been behind the scenes, or talked to executives, worked with executives at Shell and BP and so on, and those discussions are in good faith. They're really engaged, but there is a real challenge. So a number of challenges. Culturally, they are oil and gas companies. That is what they do, and they do it well. And society is sending those mixed signals, because there most likely is going to be demand on current trends. There's going to be demand for oil and gas that goes beyond 2050. And so then the question in the boardrooms and amongst the executives of those companies is, what would you like us to do? Walk away from that demand. It will be met by companies that are, it'll be met by others. Now, you could say, well, that's fine. I mean, that argument was used against the abolition of slavery. If the British don't allow their ships to be used, then other countries, principally the French, would do so in their place, and therefore we shouldn't abolish slavery. And at some point you just say, I don't want to hear it. We're just going to not sell this stuff. We're just going to move away from the oil and gas, and that's it. But it is a very complicated discussion. And of course, the other thing that's happening is those companies are still paying our pensions. Almost certainly, most of the people on this call, unless they have explicitly divested, which some of them no doubt have, and kudos to them, but most of us haven't. And so those companies are still funding an awful lot of state spending, and they're funding an awful lot of our pensions. So it's not a trivial discussion. I would like to think that as the technologies accelerate, that those companies will do exactly what countries did between Paris and now, and actually bend the curve more rapidly as they see a strategic playing field open up for them as transition companies. And I think that's what will happen with the European companies. I'd like to think that now we've got the new administration in the US, that the US companies will join them. We are seeing the first moves, some of the Chinese oil companies talking about net zero. They are probably further behind in a sort of authenticity journey. And of course, we've still got the majority of oil that is produced by national oil companies. And I think they will be the last to move because they're so central to their host countries or their owners' economic models.
We are running out of time, and there are still a lot of interesting questions here, but maybe we should end with, again, thinking of our audience where there's a lot of people who are working on the transition. What do we need to get right now? What would you recommend they focus on as a high leverage area of work?
Gosh, I mean, I'm assuming there's quite a diversity of activities and skills in the audience base. And what's so fascinating about this transition is there's not a field that it doesn't touch. Obviously, all branches of engineering and science, but also policy making and the anthropology, the politics. And I think that's an area that maybe, and it may be that the people on this call, because they're typically economists and financiers, that is not their natural sort of environment, but really thinking through how to bridge that gap between the two, in a sense, the two energy worlds within civic society, the one that wants us to clamp down on emissions and the one that wants to continue consuming. And by the way, by that, I don't think that the right response should be to promote degrowth. I think that is a fool's errand, because we actually need we've done a magnificent job as a global economy to bring people out of poverty, to improve education, medical services, to include women in the workplace. Infant mortality is down. life span is up. And so degrowth, we've seen what degrowth looks like. It looks like a sort of slow and permanent version of the COVID catastrophe. So it's not that. When I talk about working on the demand side, I'm principally talking about substitution, substituting the demanding uses of fossil fuels principally with cleaner solutions. And I think long term, if we don't do that, then all of this activism and all of the pressure, it'll get us a certain way. As I say, it might get us to, towards, we're currently on track for 3. If you get those pledges, you might get to 2, but we're not going to get, that's going to be in doubt. So I would work on the demand side, substituting clean solutions.
Terrific. Well, I think there's still so much to talk about, and we'll probably have to hold that for another meeting, maybe in person, where we can share a beer with you. So I'm going to turn it over right now to, thank you very much, Michael, and I'm going to turn it over to Sandy for the next part.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael and Sergio. That was a terrific discussion and gave us a lot of food for thought, I think, for the next couple of weeks of our conference. We're glad so many of you were able to join us online today, and we hope that you will stick around for another 10 minutes to watch the very first in our series this year of videos on local leadership, global change. We'll be highlighting the remarkable work being done by organizations in the Philippines to accelerate the energy transition there. We hope you'll join us here tomorrow at the same time for our next session, which is called Coal in the U.S., Implications for Communities as the Pace of Closures Quickens. You'll also note in your agenda a number of side meetings over the next few days. You're welcome to join any of those. Thanks again for being here with us today, and goodbye.
I'm Lidi Nakpil. I'm the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development and also the convener of the Asia Energy Network.
I'm Red Constantino. I'm with the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. We work on fair climate policy and low carbon development. We're based in Manila, but we also work with governments in Africa, Latin America, and Asia.
I'm Sarah Jane Ahmed. I'm a finance advisor to the vulnerable group of 20 ministers of finance of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. It's a group of 48 climate vulnerable developing countries focused on enhancing climate action. The Philippines is in the top 10 of all climate vulnerability rankings.
One of our big campaigns is the campaign to end fossil fuels and make the swift transition to democratic and renewable energy systems. We're campaigning against coal not just for its immediate polluting effects on communities, but also because its huge contribution to climate change. I started out as an activist fighting the dictator in the 1980s, but at that time, we thought that, well, environmental issues are not as urgent as the fight for our lives and our survival under a dictatorship. But we were wrong. I acknowledge many years later, because with stopping climate change, there is only a window of time that we have to do decisive action. For years, we have been battling against this mantra of government and energy producers saying that coal is our main option because it's cheap and we are a developing country. We need to have cheap energy, that there's urgency in bringing electricity to people. All those many years of campaigning are bearing fruits. We finally got the Department of Energy to declare a moratorium on new coal projects. It's a temporary suspension. It's not a permanent ban. So it's not like we can be complacent about it. We've also gotten a few banks to say that they're no longer going to fund new coal projects because of the local resistance and the national campaigns of various groups. There have been at least 19 coal power plants in the pipeline that have been stalled or delayed for the last 3 to 4 years. We've also gotten the support of bishops of the Catholic Church that have explicitly called for the phase out of coal power. So we're quite happy that we have reached this point.
To be climate vulnerable would be that you are disproportionately impacted by climate change. So if you're a small island developing state or in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, you are more impacted, which means you see more extreme weather events. You are susceptible to higher risk due to sea level rise, in addition to other concerns such as being a developing country.
We're 7,000 islands bordering the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, and we're so vulnerable to typhoons and extreme weather events. Now, they're more frequent and they're super typhoons, very strong ones.
We need to also understand, however, that vulnerability is not just equated, should not be equated with disasters. There's also such a thing as slow onset climate events that take place without the drama of calamity, but which actually punish local economies even more. Rising sea levels, changes in hydrology, less rainfall here, more rainfall there, punishment in the long term for economies that rely on agriculture and predictable seasons. The country imports most of its fossil fuels. It depends on importations of coal, around 80% of which comes from Indonesia. And so when we talk about the energy transition, it encompasses several facets of development. Energy security is central, obviously, because we should be relying on our own sources of power rather than importing fuel from abroad. At the same time, we want to modernize our sector because we want to be able to consume power where it's produced, and a large part of the population are so isolated. The question is it better to connect them to the main grid or to establish decentralized distributed renewable energy systems? I favor more that small islands actually are independent of the main grid, because then they can enjoy their own power. Renewable energy is actually going to work best for them. So wind and solar, hydro, geothermal are all going to be really critical to the country's energy future and the country's ultimate development trajectory. We need to bake the climate crisis into the long-term development strategies of developing countries.
In a time of transition, this is where the old technologies try to find relevance, the new technologies try to enter. So this is where we are now. It's a tug of war of what technology mix will one choose and will one go with.
The debate has yet to be won in terms of fossil gas, because government understandably is seeing fossil gas as an opportunity to bring in cleaner energy compared to coal. But I think because there will be elections next year where a new administration will be coming in, we are confident that we are going to be able to convince government that if they consider natural gas or fossil gas as a bridge fuel, they need to spell out where does that end.
The transition that we're discussing today should be within this decade. And that's the issue with gas right now, is that there's no contract that is less than 10 years. There's no contract that's just, 2021 to 2030. The contracts are 20, 25 years or longer. And that's not necessarily a transition. That's a lock-in.
What is killing coal right now is also going to kill gas in the near future.
Southeast Asia and South Asia are growth markets. They're developing. And the potential for manufacturing, service, exports, all of this is huge. And to remain competitive in trade and output, we need low-cost power. And unfortunately, gas is just expensive, it's volatile, it doesn't offer that opportunity for countries to be cost competitive. Looking at that perspective, gas doesn't make sense, but the reason it's being pushed is because the US has a glut in supply. Japan has an entire logistics chain that supports gas. Australia also trying to offload gas. There are a lot of folks that have invested in gas and they're looking to sell it somewhere and they're unable to sell it in their markets. So what happens, as they did with coal, they look at developing countries.
One of the great injustices of this is that developing countries have contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions, but we take on the brunt of the impacts of climate change. And that's something that we always need to reiterate. We're not largely responsible for this. The rich are, and they have a responsibility to address the impacts for a problem that they created. One of the things that we're working on is the mobilization and delivery of climate finance. It's part of the international obligations of parties to the climate convention. We use every arena we can participate and engage in, from the streets to the corridors of international negotiations, to raise this issue. On the one hand, you're stopping climate change. On the other hand, you have to enable people and communities to deal with the already present impacts. And how do you balance that? I'm often asked what should be prioritized, and I said I don't think we have the luxury of deciding which is priority. We have to do both.
I am quite confident that the country will end up in the right landing zone where renewable energy will be the dominant power generation in the mix. The challenge is answering this big question: can we arrive sooner? Can we shave off 5, 7, 10 years from long campaigns so that people will gain the benefits sooner and we can avoid harm to tens of thousands in a quicker way? Look, I'm in an institute that believes that we can change the world. And, some people will call that a delusion. I would say that if I wasn't doing something that would change the world in my mind, I ask the big question: what's the point?
As campaigners, we have to be optimistic. I mean, it's our business to try and do the impossible. In my experience, in my life experiences, we brought down dictators. So if we can do that, we can do anything because we faced quite a lot in that process. The realism that we need to have is to recognize that our opponents are not going to give up without a real fight. So you need to really build your power and use that power in order to compel them. That's our contribution to the fight, to build that power of people for collective action.